Hi, I'm Jordy Deelight. I'm 27, nearly 28. I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I have cystic fibrosis and make work about that.
My name is Dominic Quagliozzi. I am 40 years old from Massachusetts, United States. I am 7 years post double lung transplant, and I also have cystic fibrosis. And I also make visual and performance art. You have more performing experience, so it is, maybe you can lead the way here.
Yeah, totally. I was just gonna jump into a question I actually had that I kind of, it's a general question. So for me, I work in autobiographical theatre and film, so a lot of the stuff I do, I can kind of resonate with a lot of your own work. And I just wondered, what moment specifically inspired your career and making work about having CF? Was there a point where you just knew, or was it a way of sort of coping with living with CF?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. I think, I was making art from a young age, and I started off by using art to kind of hide the fact that I had CF. So I made a lot of art about everything except having a chronic illness and CF. And it was through high school and early in my undergrad college career where I was making, figurative and abstract kind of hybrid type paintings about just kind of, like I said, anything other than CF and having CF. And I think I got into my third year of college, undergrad. So I was like in my early 20s, and I was just in the hospital so much, having chronic hemoptysis, and just taking, weeks and weeks off from school, and coming back and getting back into my painting classes. And some of my friends, like, where have you been, and like, what's going on? And then I just kind of started to talk about it with my friends and roommates in college. And they're the ones that kind of were like, you should think about making work about that. And so that's kind of when I started to make work about having cystic fibrosis, being in the hospital, which is funny because a lot of the work that I made previous to that was made while I was in the hospital, but it was just about other things, you know what I mean? So kind of bringing it back into making work about myself, cystic fibrosis, kind of like what my experience as a patient was, started to really resonate. And because I think part of it was I was always kind of like that internal ableism that I had. Like I was always kind of ashamed I had CF, and it made me feel like less than or other. And I felt like if I started making work about cystic fibrosis or being a patient, people would be turned off by that. They wouldn't necessarily relate to it. But what I found, actually the opposite started happening. People started finding their own issues and their own sensitivities in the work that I was making for their own selves or their own situations. So that's kind of really where it got rolling.
I think that's great, because for me personally, like, it was a similar experience, although for me it was more about, there was a lot of internal ableism of, I don't want people to know this stuff about me because I'm ashamed of it for years. But when I fell into the world of drag, when I was sort of DJing in the nightlife, I was like, what's everyone doing in drag that I'm not? Like, everyone's doing like splits. I don't know if you know much about drag, but they do death drops and splits and stuff, and I couldn't obviously do that. And at the same time, I was going through like a lot of health issues. And what I kind of thought was, well, the best way as sort of an art therapy, in essence, was to sort of do drag, but do stuff about CF that were considered taboo things that actually ended up educating a lot of people.
Yeah.
I had similar experiences to you, that a lot of people were like, oh my God, I'm learning about CF through watching a drag show.
Yeah, I guess that was actually one of my questions I wanted to start with too, is did you ever see your drag, I don't know, is it like considered an alter ego or just like part, I'm not sure like how a person in drag identifies there. Is that a character, or maybe you could kind of explain that a little bit, and then I'll just kind of follow up with the question that I had.
I love that. It's a great question, actually. I think so. I'm non-binary, and very much like a lot of people that are non-binary do drag, and a lot of people that are trans do drag, but not everyone that does drag is trans or non-binary. So I think people often kind of they can't really differentiate between the two. For me, I used to, when I was doing drag, I had a persona which was like the Real Housewife of Leaf. So it was like the Real Housewives of Atlanta, but
Yeah,
I lived in sort of a council estate, which is like a rent control apartment in the UK. And it was very much like this glamorous Stepford wife that lived in this scheme or sort of a working class area, which was really funny. So that was always what I did. And then I did a lot of disability awareness for my persona, but it was a persona. Like the good thing about drag was putting the makeup on, going on stage, taking it all off, coming home and just being me for a bit, which was really nice. But then it almost felt like I could never really deal with my CF outside of that persona. So I was kind of creating, in the long term, I was creating more issues for myself because I was like, oh, all the work I do is about having CF and I would like to do other things now. I've kind of boxed myself in a way. So and now I don't really do drag necessarily. I'm just non-binary artist who does a lot of sort of genderqueer art. But at the time, between 2016 to 2020, it was very much I was a drag queen. I wore wigs. Had my eyebrows were covered with glue, and you couldn't see them. So that was that's been my journey. Yeah.
And did you see a lot of overlap between the drag persona and getting the preparation into becoming that drag performer and the preparation you have to take care of yourself with CF?
What a great question. Oh my gosh, I've never been asked that. That's a good one. I think for me, the difficulty came when I was needing lung transplant, and it was like I had to kind of attribute when could I have time to do drag and be also well, because I had to do a lot of home IV medication. I was constantly going to the transplant center every 3 months for assessment because I never got listed for it, but I was in that fine, narrow line of not well enough to kind of be functioning as a human being, but not ill enough to get it. It was a really weird small window. So that was when I was really like, I don't know how I could factor in the time for drag in 2019. There was a lot of times where I was like, my makeup would take me 2.5 hours. And then half of my treatments, like my nebulizers, would take me up to 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So, that was a good 5-6 hours of my day gone. And I needed to sleep as well. So it became quite a challenge in that regard. I think the things that people didn't realize, particularly in the drag community, was things like, obviously, I wasn't as high energetic performing. So I was great at lip syncing Whitney Houston and doing a ballad, but I wasn't ever going to be dancing about to a track. And if I did do it, I'd watch back and go, I'm so stiff and stagnant because of the fact that in heels, that is a challenge for me. So yeah, it was an eye-opening experience, but I think it was that thing as an artist in general of play to your strengths. Like I was like, well, I can't jump about and dance, but I can lip sync a really sad ballad and everyone gets emotional.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about the preparation and the times when CF kind of overtook your abilities to be the artist that you wanted to be. Because I think like early on in my career too, that started happening, in 2011 and 12 is when I was told I need a transplant, and I started to get listed in 2011, 2012. And at the time I was making, 5 to 6 foot large, sometimes even 7 foot large paintings, which took a lot of labor to construct. And and my physical health wasn't good enough, and that's kind of what pushed me into doing performance. So I started like you mentioned, the CF kind of needing all that time to do treatments and stuff. And I was doing the vest 4 times a day and nebulizers and IV home antibiotics, and it was taking over all the time I had. I didn't have any time or energy to get into the studio. So I basically was like, I'm going to just kind of reformat my practice. And I started taking those treatments and doing them in public spaces around Los Angeles. And that, so I kind of put the studio work, besides like smaller drawings and paintings, on the, like I pushed that a little bit to the side, and I started doing more of these like medical treatment performances and stuff like that.
Yeah, do you know, that kind of leads me on to my question I had for you nicely, actually. When I was doing a show in 2019, I was doing a lip sync and it was a Cinderella song, but I did a sinus rinse. I don't know if you ever had to do those, but rinse out with the salt water. It's horrible. And I did it on stage and everyone was like, oh, because they didn't obviously feel comfortable watching.
Yeah, right.
It totally worked. But my thing was, when I looked at your work, because I think your work's incredible, I actually went to art school in 2018. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is really my vibe and my style of work. What I wondered was, when you did your sort of performance work inside the hospital, did it feel performative or did it actually feel more authentic? Because when I've done like autobiographical work, have actually found it quite challenging to know what's a performance and what's real.
Yeah. So yeah, I think like you mentioned that word authenticity, and like I'll mention Bob Flanagan. I think everyone with CF kind of, he's like our godfather. The work that he did was just absolutely amazing. But I talk about the influence he had on my work, but him being a little bit more on the theatrical side and kind of making, in a way, especially with his show that he did at the new museum called Visiting Hours. He constructed a hospital room inside the museum, and that's kind of like a set for a play or a movie, And when I was creating those performances, I didn't really do any other manipulation other than bringing the equipment into the public space. And then when I did the hospital show, that kind of social action performance type piece, I made these small drawings and paintings in the hospital for the first week. And then the second week, I had gallery hours. People come in and I had the work hung up on the wall. And the only artistic intervention I did was invite people in as it was a gallery space rather than a hospital room. And so, to the authenticity, I didn't want to make it overly theatrical and kind of put that distance. I wanted to just kind of bring people into my space as is, or take myself and put myself into the public space as is. So that's kind of where I was coming from for those type of performances. And I think to me, they felt authentic. Like the hospital show kind of felt like it was like a dual thing. I was a patient getting treatment in bed, like talking to friends that came to visit me, but also like how I interact at art openings and trying to, talk up the work and kind of make it a little bit more like, hey, like you should buy this work, and, have the visitors get to know me and want to participate in my career by supporting me and buying work and things. So it was like this really interesting kind of dynamic there. Yeah, it was, it was also fun to do.
Yeah. I loved looking at the images on your website. I think it looked brilliant. It was really striking and I felt a lot of personal connection with it. I remember doing a photo shoot in 2019 where I've seen your suit, and your suit is like all the hospital gowns, isn't it? Done a photo shoot where it's me holding up fabric that was to be made into a dress that was actually all my old x-rays put onto fabric. So I was like, oh my gosh, I love this suit. I want to buy it and wear it.
Yeah.
And what I found funny was Martin O'Brien, who's a London-based artist in the UK.
Yeah, love Martin.
Oh my God, I know him and he's so lovely. We don't obviously see each other due to cross-infection, but he's brilliant, and I interviewed him for a podcast and we talked about Bob Flanagan all day, like just such an incredible artist in the CF community.
Yeah. It's weird. I feel like the CF artists I know, it's like not necessarily that we choose to use our bodies in our work. It just kind of happens, right? It just feels the most right. And when you're an artist and you feel like you're in that groove and everything's kind of connecting, that's how I kind of like, I didn't necessarily consciously go in that direction. It kind of just, the work kind of took me by the hand and brought me there.
feel that. And for me, like I teach a lot of kids as well and about this sort of stuff. And I always say, create work about stuff and it makes sense for us to go, what do I know well having CF? What can I make like work about that? So I totally get that. There was a question I had that I found really interesting. So in 2020, I did a show and it was a drag show, but it was like a pantomime. I don't know if you know what a pantomime is like in the UK, but it's like a sort of this show. So we did that. And it was about lung transplants. And it was this girl who was, going for a lung transplant assessment, but she didn't need it. And how was she going to kind of deal with that? And that's what was going on in my life at the time. But what I found quite interesting for me is you've had your transplant, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
I know from my brain what it was like creating work when I didn't need transplant, when I did. And then I don't know what the situation is with medication where you are, but I got put on Kaftrio, which is also known as Trikafta.
Yeah.
And I was put on that on the drug trial in 2020, and that stopped me needing transplant in the moment. And I just wondered, what was it like for you as an artist to make work about, when you weren't well, needing transplant, and then the difference when you now have had transplant? Because I can't understand what that would feel like.
Yeah, that's a great question. And and also congratulations on the Kaftrio. I read that, and seeing somebody that needs a transplant and then gets Kaftrio and then at least for the time being doesn't, it's just kind of a magical, it's like incredible. And well, I always had this set, like when I was in grad school, I was talking to my studio mate, and I was telling him one day, I was like, I was in grad school while on the transplant list waiting for lungs. And I was like, I obviously want new lungs because I want to continue living and I need them. I was on oxygen full time, needed wheelchairs here and there because my mobility wasn't great. I was just like, you could just feel and see my life winding down. And it was, it was really hard and difficult. But on the artist in me was like, hey, like I'm actually very nervous, not about the actual surgery or anything, but like when my CF lungs are gone, am I still going to have any kind of artistic inspiration, ability? Like I felt like all the good stuff about my artistic practice, I felt like came from my CF lungs and that kind of struggle. So that was a very difficult thing. And it's been a lot of, I've been doing a lot of work personally and emotionally trying to work through that and kind of reconcile those differences. And I was actually going to kind of mention or ask you a similar question. As an artist, what was it like to get kind of right up until that point where you were asked by your doctors to think about transplant and what you were going to do? And then I couldn't imagine being able to walk that back. I feel like for me, it was so finite.
I had quite a difficult experience because I went in with this, I can fully disclose this. I was dealing with a lot of health issues at the time, but I was so against really thinking about my CF at the time. Like I was, I'd learned how to do IV medication in 2017, so I would be fine because I was doing enough. And I was working freelance in youth theatre as like a teacher, so like teaching kids drama and still doing drag and DJing. And I was like, I'd got into quite a serious relationship with someone. So I was like, oh, well, maybe him and I are going to be together for the rest of my life. So, do I want to consider having children one day with him? And obviously, how can you do that? Because sometimes CF can limit biologically having children. So I was like, I went in to have a discussion with them about, what are the options for people with the CF that will have kids? And kind of got lumbered with, we want to talk to you about transplant that same moment. And I went, wow. It was kind of like my whole world just got flipped.
Yeah.
I think, and I'll be honest, I can't believe I'll say this, I think subconsciously I did know something else was coming. Because like there were points at my appointments where things would get grazed a little and I'd go, oh, but this is what's going on right now for me. And then eventually when I'm like, I want to talk about this, I think they kind of just went, this is the time to lay this on you. Do I grudge that? No, because they dealt with it in a right way at the time, because it's so different now. It's quite alien. I know I mentioned to you Kaftrio, but my brain still now goes, what is my life right now? Like if I'm in the Matrix and I'm going to wake up because it's not actually like happening. So I'm always like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? But at that time, they kind of fast tracked me in a way because they were like, if anything happened, I could get really ill and then maybe not recover.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, I got flu, and literally what they thought happened, which was quite spooky. That I'd got a really bad flu, my lungs were like bricks, really horrible thing to go through. And then I never really kind of recovered, kept getting colds, viruses, etc., and just kept getting ill. So I think mine did come out of nowhere, and I was so against lung transplant because I just kept thinking, well, if I get that, I might die. Like, yeah. I'm not anymore, but I used to be such a cynical person that I'd always think the worst of things. So I was like, oh, I'll die. There's no point getting it. And I kept fighting against it. And then in 2019, things were just really difficult. I knew that I needed it. And I sort of mentally went on a journey where I was like, right, do you know what? Like, I'll start just accepting this because things are not improving. But then it's a weird one. The CF team where I was at were like, you need to get this, you're not well. But then I went to my transplant center who were like, you're too well for us. So I was always going like this, like, where am I going? Getting batted from place to place. And I think the creating work aspect about that was probably the only safety net really at that point, the only coping mechanism. Because I felt like I recently made a movie last year that's called 2 in the morning, 1 at night, and it's about medication. And it's kind of, at the moment, I'm writing something, but it was kind of the last thing I did about CF in 2021. And that there was a quote, I worked with a girl remotely on Zoom who has CF, and there was a quote we came up with that was like, I was just existing, I wasn't living. And that was what I felt like in 2019. Like, I didn't really feel like I was actually living, I just felt like I was here physically in this world, but mentally I wasn't even here. So it was really a difficult period. But I think after CAFTO, it was interesting because it's like in 2020, I was sort of in this wee bubble of, right, and was isolating because of COVID, the pandemic. And I was like, what am I going to do? Because I'm well. So normally I'd make work about being ill, but things are going well. Do people want to know about that? And then when I'd got the commission from the Scottish Mental Health Arts Festival, that's the movie 2 in the morning, 1 at night, that very much was like, okay, maybe I could create work about CF is changing now. I'm always mindful just when I get interviewed because some places it's not available. And then I think it's only 90% of CF gene types can get it. I'm not too sure. I'm not a scientist, but there's a community in the UK that the 10% just can't get it. So I'm always like, right, well, we need more for other people then. Like, creating work now. I mean, recently I've been funded to write a musical, which I've never done before, but because of CAFTO, I can now sing, which is quite cool. And that's all about sort of starting CAFTO and realizing loads of things about myself whilst isolating during the pandemic. And that's kind of the trilogy, because I did one autobiographical show in 2019 that was all about CF. I did my show, The Honeymoon Period, which was the transplant show in 2020. So this musical, fingers crossed, is going to happen next year. And that's kind of I think that's me moving away from, at the moment, creating work about CF, because what I do like that you said is, I think everyone now is like, oh, I've got CAFTO, I'm not going to ever get a transplant. And I'm like, that's not how it works. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know what the future holds.
And it's interesting you mentioned like having kids, and I was always never thought I'd have kids, never whatever. And, you know, I was with my wife before my transplant, and we said, you know, if I do make it to transplant and I get a transplant, we might want to consider having kids. So I had my sperm frozen. And then 3 years ago, we did IVF and it was successful. And I have a 2.5-year-old son, and he's a rock star. But it's also made me think so much about, as someone who was always being taken care of, what that is now like to take care of someone else. And like, literally like somebody that can't do anything for themselves. And my wife and I do everything for him. And then like right now we're potty training and like all these things. And, you know, so it's like all the fears I had about like not being able to make work because I lost my CF lungs. Now I'm like, you know, like I'm making stuff about what I know and what my life is like now. And that it does still involve CF in some ways, but it involves a lot of other things too. So, yeah.
I love that, because for me, I feel like it's, obviously I can't speak on transplant, but what has happened for me in the last few years is acknowledging the conditioning aspect of having CF, therefore I am disabled, therefore someone will always take care of me. And I love that you mentioned this about, you know, you're like having to take care of your son, and oh my gosh, this is like an eye-opening experience for you, because I recently had a family member who got quite poorly, and I was having to kind of get involved in that, take the reins, and I thought, this is unusual, this is quite jarring. Now, is that a bad thing? Absolutely not. Like, I'm happy to help someone, but I thought, oh, it's almost like a role reverse now. This is really weird. And it's almost foreign, I would say, is the word for me. Like, I've been told some, and I think that comes down to, unfortunately, like, you know, the mortality rate is a huge emphasis from when you're a kid, teenager, you know.
Yeah.
I think I'd have been out 13. I did a high school project, like, on CF, and Googled CF, and the first thing that came up was life expectancy, and I went, holy shit, like, did not need that, like, at 13-year-old. Like,
yeah, right.
So I think when that emphasis is placed on that for so long, you then as an adult are going, hold on, actually, what's going on? I'm really glad that the transplant's obviously like done so well for you. I wonder, just because I never obviously got it, I just wonder what did it, you know, when you watch those videos and you see someone, they start breathing through their new lungs for the first time and they're like, oh my gosh, and it just, you see it in that face. Like, what did it feel like after the transplant? Did you just feel completely reinvented?
Well, yeah, see, that's the funny part about it. And like that experience never happened for me, because the first like week or so, I had tons of mucus. I was super wheezy. I had a blockage in one of my lungs. One of the other lung was like slightly, like partially collapsed. So like I was telling people like that were visiting, I'm like, this is bullshit. I didn't get my like revelation moment, like this huge breath in. I had to have a bronchoscopy where they like did lavage and like sucked out a bunch of crap. And it actually took me, or this is like super gross, but the respiratory therapist was like that. I don't know what you call it in Scotland, but like when you cough up like the mucus, like we call it loogies here. They're just like the big mucus, like green, you know, whatever. Well, anyway,
I know what those are, but I've never heard of that phrase.
Yeah. Well, so the respiratory therapist said after transplant, the first loogie is not your own, meaning like it's from the donor. I know it's disgusting. So like I was coughing up like all this like red and purple and like disgusting. We call them phlegm skittles. It's totally nasty. It took me a couple weeks to get my lungs fully expanded, get them cleared out, and take those big breaths. But my first PFT, I was only at like 55% lung function. It took me like about 2.5 months to get up to my peak, which was 93% FEV1. But that blew my mind. It was just like, holy shit, I never had a PFT that good in my whole life. And so, yeah, like it is a absolutely mind-blowing experience. I was in the hospital for 12 days after my transplant, and I think I was basically crying like all 12 days just because it was so, like, the amount of joy for life itself. Like, you know, I'm like having nurses wipe my ass and I'm just crying, thanking them, being so grateful to get like to have this new experience and stuff. So yeah, I mean, and I think too, like as an artist, you make work and it kind of releases a lot of chemicals in your brain, like sometimes satisfactory, sometimes makes you more pissed off because you're not doing what you wanted to do or whatever. But I felt like I didn't make work for a little while after transplant, like almost a year, because I was getting all of those needs met from just living this new lifestyle where I didn't have oxygen. I didn't have to do any treatments aside from just the pills, you know, like, so I was like, this is amazing. Like, this is what it is to not have to worry about having illness. And then, you know, I had a little bit of rejection and my white blood cell count was really low and I was in the hospital a bunch. So then like the new reality started to hit. Like you did that project, the honeymoon period. Like my honeymoon period was pretty much over around 1 year. I had chronic rejection and stuff. So, but still, it's still been amazing. And yeah.
No, that was great, because for me, listening to that, like that, yeah, I think to me it's kind of like that adapting and processing of, you know, this is a physical thing, but this is an emotional thing. You know, they're interlinked. Like you have to adapt to these new lungs, you have to connect with them, and then emotionally you have to process all the stuff that you're really well all of a sudden. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is like a rush of ecstasy, but also, is this real? So I totally get the attention was maybe just focused on that. The thing with the honeymoon period, I want to tell this story just because it is quite funny. It's one of those phases that everyone's like, oh, the honeymoon period, something beautiful. It was an absolute, like, an irony title, because I had been told by sort of a clinician who's, bless him, I think he was meaning well, but it was a bit arsey. He'd said to me, like, oh, you're going for a honeymoon period of health, so you don't need transplant anymore. And I kind of went, and I'd said to him, like, you think this is fun? And he went, oh, and I was like, I'm coming back and forth here and getting told by them I'm chill and by you that I'm really well. Like, come on, like, honeymoon period, really? And I just got, I'm one of these people that I would never, I really actually now I'm good at emotionally regulating, ironically enough. But at the time I was like, I'm so angry at this one phrase. This one phrase is really pissing me off. Like, not the whole situation, that one thing he said. And I went, right, that's a great title for a show, though, because people are going to come and go, the honeymoon period, a drag show, that sounds so fun. And then it's like, boom, lung transplant. They were like, whoa. I
love that. Yeah, that's good. So good.
So yeah, I totally do get that, because there was a huge part for me in 2020, genuinely, where I was like, if I don't want to do work with CF anymore, what do I want to create? So I do completely understand that. And at the moment, I've been writing a lot of plays that are quite political, because, you know, we're in 2022 and the world is a bit of a mess after the pandemic. So, I mean, it always has been. But recently I've been like, I want to go down a political route. So, yeah. And I think this musical might be the last thing with CF, but the emphasis on lung transplant potentially still need to happen is huge, because I've always said that to people. They've been like to me, oh, you know, you don't have to worry about transplant anymore. Do you feel like you've just dealt with that and it's gone? And I've always been like, not really. Like, if anything, I just feel like I now know more than I knew. Like, I'm not gonna, I think a lot of people thought that I would unfilter and just switch that off. And I'm like, no, like, that isn't something that leads.
Right.
Like, I need to remember, it might change in just how they do the procedures in the future. But I was like, no, I need to remember that, because that was an important part of the CF life that might still always be there. Yeah,
for sure. And I, like, even for me, like, I've had a transplant, and the possibility of needing another transplant is, you know, a very real possibility. It's just, you know, as a person with a chronic illness, you just try to keep outlasting the disease. You know, the disease is relentless, but you have to be just a little bit more relentless than the disease, you know.
This might just be for me, this might be for other people, I don't know, or even a show or a piece, but what I want people to know is that you come first and you can fix it.